International news now.
Okay, so now we want to talk about an important development in the Syrian war from over the weekend. Now, note that we'll probably be returning to this. This could be a really explosive issue. So we're going to give you some background about this today, but sort of keep watching it over time. On early Saturday morning, an Iranian drone launched from a Syrian base crossed over into Israeli territory, okay? That drone was shot down by the Israeli military. Israel responded to that threat by launching a series of air attacks from their F-16 fighter jets on the Syrian base near Palmyra that launched the drone. The Syrian government then shot down one of these F-16s when they shot it down over Syrian airspace, but then it crashed over Israeli territory. And they used an anti-aircraft missile to do that. And then Israel responded with 12 attacks on Syrian and Iranian targets within Syria. You wanted to add
why don't we go to the tablet here and we can give you some sense of what was going on. So here you can see, so this is the Syrian conflict. What I have, this is what's highlighted on the map here, which this is where that drone was launched from, and so Israel launched the strikes on that target, and then when their plane was shot down, they launched another series of targets on bases within Syria, right there in the southwestern part of Syria on Saturday, I believe.
All right. So what's so important about this is that this marks a new stage in this broader Syrian conflict. Now, while Israel has repeatedly launched bombing runs in Syria, so this isn't the first time it has bombed things in Syria, they have previously targeted military convoys moving weapons to Hezbollah in Lebanon. That's an organization that has historically fought with Israel. And they've targeted these military convoys as they were moving through Syria on their way to Lebanon. This latest event was the first direct military exchange between Iran and Israel, and that's what makes it so potentially important and dangerous. The Prime Minister of Israel responded publicly that Israel would defend itself and that Israel would hold both Iran and its Syrian hosts responsible for the military escalation of the conflict that started on Saturday. Israel has repeatedly warned the international community that Iranian forces are digging in and establishing bases of operations in Syria along its border with Israel. So now we're going to watch a quick video that summarizes the events over the weekend. Then we will come back and provide a broader introduction to the Syrian civil war and all the various international players in that conflict. So let's go ahead and roll that video now.
Well, the war in Syria is spilling beyond its borders and raising tensions between Israel and Iran. An Israeli fighter jet went down in Israel this weekend after coming under heavy anti-aircraft fire. The plane was involved in airstrikes on Iranian targets inside Syria. Seth Doan is in Harduf, Israel, at the site of the crash. Seth, good morning.
Good morning. This is where that Israeli F-16 crashed. The pilots ejected and survived, but it was the first time an Israeli military jet had been shot out of the sky since the early 1980s. And shockingly, it was struck down inside Israeli airspace by a Syrian anti-aircraft missile. A military intelligence chief we spoke with today said he worries this could be the start of a new phase in this war that has ground on for 7 years in Syria, one where we see a direct confrontation between Iran and Israel. Over the weekend, Israel saw what it had long worried about: Iran allegedly using a base from inside Syria to launch a drone into Israeli territory. Israelis shot the drone out of the sky once it entered Israel's territory and then launched F-16s in retaliation to target both Syrian and Iranian positions inside Syria. Then it appears Russian President Vladimir Putin stepped in to try to calm things down. The Russians would like to see this war come to a close and not enter a new phase and escalate. John?
Seth Doan in northern Israel. Thanks.
Okay. So let's step back here, first of all, and talk some about the broader history of this conflict in Syria. Now, this is a complicated, internationalized civil war that is potentially remaking the larger Middle East. And so the first thing to do is sort of get a program, if you will. You got to know who the key actors are. So the key list of players in the conflict include Syria, of course, ISIS, Iraq, Iran, the United States, Israel, Turkey, Lebanon, Hezbollah, Russia, and the Kurds that are located in Syria, Turkey, and Iraq. So quite a long list here of various actors. The conflict in Syria began in 2011 during a wave of rebellions that spread rapidly across countries in the Middle East as part of what was called the Arab Spring. Many long-standing governments, such as those in Egypt and Tunisia and Libya, were toppled in the face of mass public demonstrations, and sometimes there was also armed conflict. In Syria, there were popular protests against the government of President Bashar al-Assad. But the Assad government used military force to repress these opposition groups, simultaneously prompting rebel groups to stage a sustained military campaign to try and topple the Assad regime. These rebel groups have been supported and funded by external actors, including Turkey, the United States, and Saudi Arabia. This extended civil war has killed between 350,000 and 500,000 people. It has also created nearly 11 million refugees from a pre-war population of 22 million people. So just think about that. Half the population of Syria was made into refugees by this conflict. About 6 million of these refugees have been displaced internally within Syria. Over 5 million of these same refugees have fled Syria. Most of those refugees who fled Syria now live in Turkey, Jordan, Lebanon, Germany, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and the United Arab Emirates. As of November 2016, the United States has taken in about 16,000 Syrian refugees. Now, this represents 0.3% of the over 5 million total war refugees from this conflict. Now, there have been multiple layers of war within this larger conflict, and that's what makes it so complicated. So I'm going to go through these layers a bit and try to do it as clearly as possible. The Syrian government, the government of President Assad, fights rebel groups trying to overthrow his regime, the Assad regime. Russia, Iraq, Turkey, the United States, Iran, Syrian Kurds, and the Syrian government, all of these actors together fight against ISIS to retake territory occupied and controlled by that terrorist organization. So that's another conflict. The Turkish military is fighting Syrian Kurds for territory in northern Syria. And now Israel and Iran are engaging in armed skirmishes over Syria. So that's a lot of different actors fighting each other, but also sometimes cooperating with each other if they have a common enemy like ISIS. So the Syrian civil war has created a failed state and a fragmented country in which various groups each control portions of the country. The Syrian government has now retaken vast pieces of territory in the southern, western, and central regions of the country. Rebel groups still hold pieces of territory in the southwestern and southern and northwestern portions of the country. Did you want to?
So let's just, so if you look at the map here that's displayed now, is the green portions are still rebel-held territory. It's shaded different colors in the northwest part up here because these rebels are also being supported by the Turkish government and the Turkish military. The gray shaded regions, right here, 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 and then there's a little spot down here in the southwestern portion of the country. Those are areas that ISIS still controls. This orange, almost burnt orange color in the middle, this is territory held by the Syrian government. And then in the northeastern part of Syria, this is territory held by the Syrian Kurds or the YPG. And then up here, this little light blue color here, these are portions of territory that are now controlled by the Turkish military.
Right. And so, as you can see from the map and from this discussion, what is really complicated about this conflict is how fragmented it is in terms of territorial control by a whole variety of different groups. And then what complicates that is that these groups are in conflict with each other for control over Syria. And for the United States, for example, we are allies with Turkey, but also have supported the YPG. And when Turkey fights the YPG, that causes problems for the United States. So that's part of the complexity. Okay, so there's another line of complexity here, and that is that Syria is divided internally along sectarian and ethnic lines. And these divisions both set opposing sides in the civil war and complicate attempts for peaceful resolution. The Assad family, that's again President Assad, his family has principally drawn its ruling coalition from Alawites in the western portion of the country.
So if we go back to the map, I'll show you before the war. Oh, hang on a second, let me draw again. So before the war, sorry, I'll get this, don't worry. Right up here, this is where most of, in the northwestern part of the country, this is where Alawites mostly live. And so they were concentrated in the northwestern regions of the country along the coastline.
Right. And the key thing to realize about the Alawites is that they are a small minority of the population. They are only about 12% of the population. And
in 2010.
In 2010. And they were geographically concentrated, as Professor McDonald showed. And this means then that Syria has been ruled by a minority group, right? Democratic rule, the democratization of the system, would undermine the privileged political position of the Alawites. Like similar decentralization and democratization did for the Sunni Baathists, the controlling group in Iraq under Saddam Hussein. Consequently, then, President Assad has limited political participation and relied on brutal authoritarian means, coercion, against his own population to remain in power, particularly since the civil war began. Now, some religious similarities between the Alawites and Shiite Islam have fostered an alliance among the Assad regime, Iran, and Hezbollah in Lebanon. Military support from Hezbollah and Iran has played a significant role in propping up the Assad government during the civil war. In addition to the Alawites, Sunni Arabs have made up about 60% of the pre-war.
Southern, sorry.
That's right. 60% of the pre-war Syrian population. And they live mostly in the western and southern regions of the country. Now, living along the northern border with Turkey are the Syrian Kurds. And the Syrian Kurds make up about 9% of Syria's population. Another 9% of Syria's population in 2010 were Arabic-speaking Christians. These Levantines lived mostly to the east of the Alawites in the northwestern part of the country. So this is a complicated demographic mix that makes this conflict even more difficult to make sense of, but also, more importantly, to get any sort of peaceful resolution to.
So the civil war has been internationalized. We've got many outside actors have participated in the conflict with military and economic aid, sometimes actively deploying troops in the larger struggle. The United States has done this. The Syrian government is supported by Russia and Iran mainly. These two countries have provided materials and military support, including airstrikes, and some ground forces to help the Syrian government remain in power and combat its enemies. As we noted earlier, the Iranians now appear to be establishing bases of operations along the Golan Heights, bordering Israel and southwestern Syria. Why don't we go ahead and bring the map up here again, and I can just show students where this is right here. This is where Israel's really concerned about, that region of the country along the Golan Heights, right there. So the rebel groups, again, those are shown in green on your map, have been supported by the United States and its allies, particularly Turkey and Arab countries like Saudi Arabia. These countries have provided materials and airstrikes to help the rebels battle the Syrian governments. Now, the United States and Turkey have long disagreed over the status of the military unit of the Syrian Kurds, the YPG, or the Kurdish People's Protection Units in the northern part of the country. In fact, last year, the United States redirected some of its own troops between Turkish troops and the YPG to help keep the peace. Now, the Turkish government views the YPG as an ally of the Kurdistan Workers' Party, or the PKK, in Turkey. The United States and Turkey have both designated the PKK as a terrorist organization. Now, the PKK is fighting the Turkish government for greater political autonomy in Turkey. As a consequence, the Turkish government worries that if Syrian Kurds grow strong in military terms through the Syrian civil war and the larger battle against ISIS, then the PKK will go stronger as well, which would then pose an even larger military and political challenge to the Turkish government at home. The United States has supported the YPG. It has relied on their forces to do a significant amount of the fighting on the ground to retake strategically important areas like Raqqa in the north-central portion of the country from ISIS. The United States supplies the YPG with significant military aid, and the Turkish government is pushing back against this. Now, right now, the United States are in a deeper political conflict over American support for the YPG. Secretary of Tillerson is in Ankara this week to try and reduce these tensions. The Turkish government has said yesterday that ties between the allies are at a critical stage. Again, the general source of this disagreement is American support for the YPG. Turkey views the growing military and political power of the Syrian Kurds as a threat. The Turkish government and military wants to defeat the YPG and eliminate its hold on territory in northern Syria. The more specific manifestation of this disagreement, the current disagreement over the last couple of weeks, is the deployment of American troops to the northern city of Manbij. I got to put my glasses on, I'm getting old, which is right up here where the cursor is. That's where Manbij is. Note that this is in yellow territory. It's held by the YPG. Turkey is in the midst now of a military operation to retake the northern region of Afrin from the YPG. And Afrin is right over here. This is this yellow portion of the territory. Again, this bluest stuff is where the Turkish government controls. To avoid a direct military confrontation with its ally, the United States, Turkey needs the U.S. to withdraw its troops from Manbij, because it wants to move, after it finishes controlling this territory here, it wants to move eastern to the east and retake territory from the YPG. But in order for Turkey to do that, it needs the U.S. to withdraw its troops from Manbij, and the U.S. is unwilling to do so. Last week, the U.S. intentionally sent 2 military commanders into Manbij from the region to send a signal to Turkey that they had no intention of doing this. More broadly, what this means is the U.S. is effectively blocking the Turkish military from taking more territory from the YPG. Finally, now, we want to emphasize here that this conflict is about which group will possess political control over Syria. A number of outside parties are participating in the Syrian civil war. Really, we should call it the Syrian war now because of all the international actors. It's no longer a civil war. Why are they participating? Because they have a stake or a political interest in this question over who's going to rule this territory 5 years from now, 10 years from now. For example, the Russian government wants Assad to remain in power. The Turkish government, they wanted ISIS out, But now they want to prevent the Syrian Kurds from controlling significant portions of territory along their southern border. This steady escalation and intervention by outside actors in the civil war, including by ISIS, Iran, Turkey, Russia, and the United States, has helped to sustain and lengthen this conflict over the last 7 years.
Okay. So we're going to leave a conversation about how ISIS fits into all of this for a future news segment. But let me just say about ISIS, there was a recent story about the conflict between the YPG and Turkey, and one of their chief complaints on the American side was that the YPG is leaving the fight against ISIS to go up to defend its compatriots against the new threat from Turkey. And so this is a complicated but also kind of problematic conflict between Turkey and the YPG for broader issues like the fight against ISIS. Now, it's important to note now that the conflict in Syria is really entering a post-ISIS phase. Now, ISIS exploited the collapse of the political authority in Syria to take significant pieces of territory across Iraq and Syria beginning in the summer of 2014. Its military campaign included terrorist attacks outside the region and genocidal attacks on civilians across Syria and Iraq. The strategic need to defeat ISIS unified a large coalition of states around a common goal. And so it's important to note how broad that coalition was. Traditionally, this diverse group of states has had opposing regional interests. Now that ISIS has largely been defeated, this coalition that was all in agreement that they wanted to push out ISIS, right? And this included the United States and Russia and Iran, all of these competing interests. This coalition is fraying. Traditional political conflicts are reemerging then as these interested parties struggle to determine which states or organizations will possess more regional power in the aftermath of the Syrian war, right? And so we all celebrated that ISIS was more or less defeated in Syria, but there's additional problems now in this post-ISIS conflict. For the rest of the discussion today, we want to briefly review the primary political interests of all the parties in this conflict. This will help us see why the conflict has been so difficult to resolve. First, let's start with the Syrian government of Bashar al-Assad. He wants to remain in power. He wants to reconsolidate the Syrian government's hold over all of the territory of Syria, and he wants to defeat the rebel groups trying to remove him from power. Now, to these ends, he's invited the Russian and Iranian governments into Syria as allies, giving them bases for operations to help him maintain and expand his power. Assad and the Syrian government, then, are stronger now that ISIS has largely been defeated. Russia wants to support its key Syrian ally in the region. And they want to do that because that will give them more influence in the broader Middle East. Now, to do that, to support Assad, it has participated in the war against Syrian rebels and ISIS to ensure that he remains in power. The Russians also possess a naval base at Tartus on the Mediterranean. The Russians also view a close political relationship with Syria as a means to counter American influence in the broader region because the United States has various regional allies: Israel, Jordan, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, right? Okay, and then there's Iran, right? Iran also wants to ensure that Assad remains in power. Iran has moved military supplies across Syria to Hezbollah, another strategic partner in the region. Iran also appears to be using the Syrian war to cultivate more political influence in Syria and the region more broadly, right? Israel worries that Iran is using the Syrian conflict to move soldiers and war material into southwestern Syria alongside the Israeli border, potentially setting up a future attack against Israel. In the initial stages of the Syrian civil war, the United States hoped that Assad would be removed from power. So the United States wants Assad out, right? or at least originally did, and it transferred economic and military aid to the rebel groups fighting against the Assad regime. However, the United States did not insert troops into Syria to fight directly against the Assad regime. American troops and special forces were inserted into Syria to fight against ISIS. However, the impending military defeat of ISIS has begun to diminish the strategic need for these American troops. Now, as you saw outlined in Obama's West Point speech, the United States has preferred to support local forces in the fight against ISIS, rather than deploy tens of thousands of American troops into these conflicts. These key local allies for the United States in this particular conflict included Syrian Kurds, or the YPG, and Iraqi Kurds, or the Peshmerga, which are under the command of the government of Iraqi Kurdistan. Now, as we mentioned earlier, American support for the YPG has provoked a significant political conflict between the United States and its NATO ally, Turkey. Turkey wants to retake Syrian territory held by the YPG, which the United States had supported, right, to prevent military cooperation between the YPG and Turkish Kurds in southern Turkey. Additionally, Turkey has supported Syrian rebel groups fighting to remove Assad from power. And this brings us back to where we started. Where does Israel fit in all of this? Israel has conducted numerous bombing raids in Syria to prevent arms transfers to Hezbollah. But a new front in this wider conflict between Iran and Israel may be opening up. Now we're going to listen to an audio clip now from National Public Radio, NPR, about this recent development, this conflict between Israel and Iran. And then we will come back to discuss Israeli interests a bit more and current American policy. So let's roll that clip now.
Where Israel is weighing a response to increasing aggression from Iran and Syria. Over the weekend, the Israeli military shot down a drone they say was sent by Iran through Syria. In retaliation, Israel conducted military raids against Iranian targets. Syrian forces shot at the jet and it crashed just over the border back in northern Israel. And that then provoked even more bombing by Israel in Syria. To talk about the escalating tension, we are joined now by Aaron David Miller. He spent decades advising secretaries of state on the Arab-Israeli peace process. He's also a distinguished scholar at the Woodrow Wilson Center. Thanks so much for being with us this morning.
Always a pleasure, Rachel.
First off, why might Iran have been attempting to fly this drone inside Israel at this particular moment?
You know, it's a very good question. The Israelis have been asking themselves that very thing, and they don't know, even though they've got the remains of the drone, which they're analyzing whether, by now they may know whether this was armed or unarmed. I think it's part of an Iranian effort building up over the last couple of years to take advantage of the situation in Syria, both for ideological and practical reasons, to increase Iranian influence, bases, weapons depots, and the possibility, should there be an Israeli-Lebanese confrontation over the border, to expand the front into Syria. And this is something, obviously, the Israelis are very worried about. But the drone penetration was a first among a number of firsts, which makes this episode quite dangerous and very volatile.
And Syria knows the stakes here, but clearly the regime of Bashar al-Assad doesn't care. They're feeling emboldened now after ousting ISIS.
Absolutely, which is the second factor in this perfect storm that's been gathering. I mean, Assad now controls roughly 80% of Syria. He's backed by the Russians and the Iranians, and he feels extremely self-confident. And look, this is an ongoing war, but this round clearly, I think, even though the Israelis struck a lot of targets, including Iranian targets in Syria, which is another first, the Syrians can claim that they've downed the first Israeli jet fighter since 1982. And that's a tremendous, for this regime, emboldened and probably overconfident, tremendous victory.
Where's Russia right now in all this?
Russia's in the middle, navigating a very, very fine line, trying to preserve its relations with Iran and with the Assad regime. Putin does not have full control over them, but he needs them on one hand, and on the other, he does not want to jeopardize what is now almost 3 years of Russian investment in Syria by encouraging the Israelis to mount a major military campaign which could undermine Assad and start an Iranian-Israeli war in Syria. So I think the reality is Putin, in some respects, is looking for a way to manage and navigate this.
So the U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson is in the region. Israel, though, is not on his official itinerary. Why might that be?
This, to me, is the most extraordinary thing about it. I mean, I remember back in the day, in both 93 and 96, we accompanied Secretary of State Christopher in two different escalations between Israel, Hezbollah, and Syria over the Lebanese border on secretarial shuttles. It's extraordinary to me. I mean, if Tillerson hadn't been previously scheduled to visit the Middle East, Cairo, Kuwait, Amman, Beirut, and Turkey, I mean, maybe they could have gotten away with phone calls and statements from the White House. But the fact that the Secretary of State of the United States of America is in the region against the backdrop of what is clearly the first significant Middle East crisis for the Trump administration, and there's no stop in Israel, strikes me as awkward at a minimum, and evidence of the fact that either the Trump administration isn't interested in this, but somehow wants to remain on the sidelines.
Aaron David Miller, he's a former State Department advisor on the Middle East and a distinguished scholar at the Woodrow Wilson Center. Thank you so much, as always, for your time this morning. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Rachel.
All right, a couple of takeaway points we want to make here. First is what's going on with Israel. They were provoked and they responded. There was a question about the drone. The drone that entered into Israeli airspace on early Saturday morning was an Iranian drone, copied off an American model of a drone that had been down in Iran, I think back in 2012. Right. So it was an Iranian drone based out of Syria. So this is a provocation. One of the questions is, why is Iran now provoking Israel? Why did they send something across their airspace? And because generally the United States and Israel have tried to stay out of this conflict. Why? And this is the case in the Iraqi war in 2003 as well. Because Israeli entry into this conflict could provide a device to unify countries in the Middle East, Arab countries, predominantly Arab countries in the Middle East, against Israel. They might disagree about a lot in terms of the composition of Syria, but generally because of domestic political pressure, they have to adopt, at least publicly, an anti-Israel position. And so Israel, and the U.S. has wanted Israel to stay out of this conflict because it can create a large counter-coalition against Israel. Second, and more broadly, and the concern here, both on the part of the United States and Israel, is this provocation could reflect a deeper regional shift in the Middle East that's been ongoing since the war in Iraq in 2003, which is in favor of Iran. Perhaps Iran is using the Syrian civil war to put more pressure on Israel by putting Iranian troops along its border. Israel views Iran as a threat. They're concerned about the shift of distribution of power in the region, Iranian support for Hezbollah, and for the Assad regime as well. Note the role of Russia and Putin in this, and I should probably defer to Rob here. Russia's made an extensive investment in the conflict. They want to prop Assad up. It looks like that's going to be successful, but they don't want to get dragged down in this conflict for decades on end. They want peace. They want things to end. The other thing that's interesting from these radio clips is, who did Israel consult with in the aftermath of the strikes? They called Putin. Right. There's a shift in terms of who is the key power broker or mediator in the region. Increasingly, it looks more like Russia and less like the United States. And this is where we got to finish with the story at the end, which is about Tillerson. Now, let me just say this thing about Tillerson, right? The commentator or the interviewee says, what's surprising in all this is Tillerson is in the region this week, but he's focused on Turkey. He's not meeting with the key American ally, which is Israel, and this is unheard of. Why? Because we could have a larger regional conflict emerging now with the provocations against Israel. And yet Tillerson looks like he's on the sidelines of this. No public meeting between the two to reinforce American support for the Israeli ally.
Right.